Good morning, good afternoon, good evening guys, gals and gentlepods, and welcome back to the shed. And yes, we are in the shed, just for a change. I'm doing a mechanical job today. I'm having a break from the welding, getting on top of me a bit, plus the weather's been quite cold and the workshop's got no heating, so it gets uncomfortable this time of year doing stuff like that. Right, so what I'm doing today is stripping the spare gearbox, which will be rebuilt using a straight cut close ratio gear set and all new bearings, obviously. It's a rib case gearbox. There's two versions of this gearbox. The smooth case fitted to early vehicles, A30s, A35s, early A40s, early Morris Minors, early midgets, I think, Sprites. The later gearbox is the rib case gearbox, which is almost identical except for the casing has got ribs on it that make it stronger, and the gears inside are stronger generally. So although from what I've been reading, the early gearboxes had a reputation for being weak, but the reality was it was bad driving on most people's cases. So hey ho, they were designed for cheap family saloons. They weren't designed for racing. So they were designed for minimal cost to do the job, and the job was to transmit power from a 30 horsepower engine to the back axle to make a small family saloon move at a reasonable pace. They were intended to be in fourth gear most of the time, which is a straight one-to-one drive, so nice and quiet, and what you put in you got out the other end pretty much. The lower gears, first gear was literally just for starting off. I think in the A30 it was expected that you would be in top gear by 20 miles per hour. Bear in mind that these gearboxes date back to an age where the average road speed was about 30 to 35 miles per hour. There were no motorways. Very, very few cars at that time were capable of speeds of 70 miles an hour plus on a long term basis. They could do it, but they wouldn't survive very long if you continued at them. So it was a continuation from the early days of the Austin 7s, if you like. This was the next generation. So anyway, let's get into it. I've got pretty much everything I need, I think, laid out. I'll give you a quick tour of that, and then we'll get into it. So we have all of the stuff that we need, I think. So number one, got myself a bucket of tea. I've got the Book of Worms. This is an official workshop manual from the 60s. So even though this details the smooth case gearbox, the rib case is virtually identical, so there's not a problem there. I've got the box of spares, so that's all the gaskets. I've got a 3/4 selector fork, which I'll explain a bit later. And then there's the first motion shaft, the lay gear, and all of the relevant bits for inside the box. I've got some blue paper towel, I've got a bin for the rubbish. And then as we move along, there's the gearbox itself. So this is one I picked up off eBay, fairly cheap. Doing it this way enables me to keep the vehicle mobile until this is done and ready to go in. That's assuming I don't find any major horrors inside this that mean it can't be rebuilt. And then when this is done and when the engine's built, the two will be put together and swapped as a complete unit. So that's the rib case gearbox. What else have we got? We have some tools. I have a universal spanner. It's a wonderful tool. I inherited that from my dad. Don't get used very often, but every now and then you need it and it gets you out of a difficult situation. I've got a good torch so that I can see inside when I need to. Flat blade screwdriver just for picking things out. A battery ratchet, very useful. Rubber mallet. Pair of gloves, because it's going to be a dirty job. And then we've got an Imperial socket set and 2 sets of Imperial spanners, stubbies and standard length. So that should cover everything that I need, and then we can get stuck in. Alright, so first things first, let's get some gloves on. I have had the side plate off this gearbox because I've run it through my business neighbour's cleaning unit, which is a wonderful thing. It's an enclosed hot pressure washer, so I've had the side plate off so that I could rinse the worst of the crud out of it. There's still some crud here on the top of the bell housing. There's some black goo that needs cleaning off, but I think I've got it clean enough that I can start and strip it down now. So the first things first, we take the extension housing off, which is this. It's the remote gear change housing. So that's 8 half-inch AF nuts. Now, whenever you're doing a job like this, and bear in mind that I haven't touched one of these gearboxes for the thick end of 40 years, so it pays to group the nuts and bolts as you take them out into little clusters, at least. That way, when you come to reassemble it, you know that that group does this bit, and that group does that bit, and that group does that bit, and so on. And hopefully that way you shouldn't get mixed up in which fixings go where. Right, so that's all those off. That should come off fairly easily, just a few tappy tap taps, and there we go. And in there's a nylon bearing, if you like, on the end of the extension shaft. That slots into there, which is the main selector shaft. Right, so that's piece number 1 off. Right, now the next piece to come off is the tail housing. So to do that, we'll stand it up on end, and it's held on by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 quarter UNF bolts. That's 7/16 socket size. There you go. So you should be able to see what I'm doing now. So we'll switch that socket for a 7/16. Now, from memory, there's one bolt that I can't get the socket on. That one, I think. So we'll undo that one first with a spanner. The next part to come off before the housing is the speedo drive. So that's where this funky spanner comes in. Okay, usually you would expect that to unscrew the aluminium thumb nut off the end of the cable. This box has come out of a break, as I'm guessing, so the cable's just been cut off with probably an angle grinder. So normally you would expect that aluminium thumb nut to unscrew from the body of the speedo pinion, and there's the speedo pinion drive itself. Right, so that's the length of the rest of the bolts, and that's the length of the bolt out of that bracket. So as you can see, they are longer, so I need to make sure I don't get those mixed up. The 3 long ones go into that bracket. And the easy way to do that is just to keep them with the bracket. So we'll put that there. Right, now this extension housing should come off. Bit of a gentle tap. This is where the torch comes in, because you need to twist this slightly to get the selector out of the slots. Right, that's it. What was happening was this selector shaft had dropped that way a little bit, and the edge of that selector rod was just trapping against there, so it wouldn't twist far enough. And say, they can be a bit of a fiddle, but not too difficult. Right, carefully remove the gasket, although we've got new gaskets, but I'll take that off anyway. Right, time to consult the book and see what's next. Not to forget, when you take that housing off, there will almost certainly be 1 or 2 shims on the rear of the main shaft, or third motion shaft as BMC call it. So we'll pop those on there so we know where they are. Right, so the next bit to come off is the front cover. So we'll turn it back on its bum. So that's the front cover. So the first thing we'll do is take out the clutch lever and release bearing. It's always reassuring when the spring washer falls apart. Oh well. At least it's not a mission critical part, eh? Oh, it's got a lock tab on it. Bit of an oddball having a tab washer on it, but there's a bit missing. There's nothing to locate it, so the tab washer was actually doing no good at all. Put those two together for a minute and we should be able to extract the clutch release lever. I'm going to pop that bolt 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 7/16 nuts. Seven. That's got it. Right. So there's a bit of liquid in there. There's remnants of oil and some of the cleaning fluid from the pressure washer I ran it through. Get that gasket off out the way. That's fit for the bin. And again, there is a shim, so we'll keep that with the front housing, front cover. So we'll put that front cover and its nuts and washers and the shim to one side, keeping the nuts by it so we know what they're from. Because it's possible that it could be, oh, there's another shim actually, didn't spot that one. Yeah, it's always possible that it could be several weeks between stripping one of these down and getting all the bits together that you need to rebuild it. And now I'm hoping that I've got everything I need to rebuild it, but there's always the possibility that I find something severely worn inside and can't do it straight away. I have to wait while I get more parts. Right, I've just had a quick read of the Book of Worms, and the clutch release fork bolt is threaded into the front cover, so that hole is tapped so the bolt screws into it, so it does need to be unscrewed. Right, the next piece to come off is the side cover. So again, 7/16 socket. I think we'll take that clutch release fork rubber out because it's just about knackered. It's all in bits. So that's one item I'll have to try and get a replacement for. Now these I'm going to just pop in that magnetic tray, because behind this cover are a couple of detents with springs. There's all those off. That's the side cover off. And there's one of the springs. Ah, there we go. So there's the two springs. Now I suspect that I've lost one of the detents when I had the side cover off and jet washed it all. So that's one I'm going to have to sort. But this now gives us access to see the inside of the gearbox. So if I just perhaps swivel this box round and show you what's inside. So this is the first, second selector fork. That's the third, fourth. Now, it's a bit counterintuitive. It's easy to think first, second would be at the front of the box, but it isn't, because fourth gear is a straight one-to-one drive. What happens is the first motion shaft, the drive from the clutch, is connected solidly to the main shaft. That's the third motion shaft, this one, so that it just drives straight through. And to do that, this fork pushes forward pushes the third fourth hub over and locks the two parts together. That's very worn, there's a lot of play on that, so that's why I got a replacement fork. The main cause of that fork wearing, and it's almost always the third fourth that goes, because lazy drivers drive along in fourth gear with their hand on the gear stick, and what that does is it puts side load on that fork and makes it wear. These are on detents, so there's a spring loaded detent plunger that locks it into its position, whether it be in neutral, third or fourth, first or second. If you sit with your hand on the gear stick, the weight of your hand and arm will put load on that, and it can push that selector rod past the detent, pushing the fork against the hub. Now, the hub's spinning, the fork isn't, so it just wears the fork away, and that's almost certainly what's happened here. There's an awful lot of lost movement in that, lost motion, before it actually moves the hub. Probably getting on for 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters of movement before it actually contacts the hub from one extreme to the other. So that's the side cover off. Back to the buck of worms and see what's next. Right, there's two plugs, two bolts there. They hold detent pins, 9/16 by the looks of it. Yep. So they've got to come off next. Watch, because there'll be a spring and detent plunger should be behind each one of these, and I don't want to lose any more bits. Also need to undo the drain plug, because that gives us access to undo the locking bolt on the reverse gear selector shaft. Strangely, 9mm is the one that fits. I don't think that is right myself, but if it fits, it fits. So we can take that pinch bolt out, or pin bolt, whatever you want to call it, withdraw the reverse selector shaft. Now you'll see there's an indent there, and there's an indent there, and there's a couple of indents there. So those two indents on the underside are the ones that that ball bearing is spring loaded against, and that's the in gear position and the out of gear position. That indent there will be, because that's in amongst the three selector shafts, there will be an interlock bearing. So if one of the shafts is in gear, the bearing is, that ball is pushed across into the groove on the other shafts, and therefore you can't select two gears at once, because that would just lock the gearbox solid and cause a lot of damage. Drain plug can go back in loosely. There's another bolt in the bottom of the gearbox, which is a 7/16 again, and that locks the reverse gear spindle in place. Stop that sliding out. when I do this, the reverse gear and its fork are going to drop, which is fine. So that's the reverse gear spindle, and the hole is where that locking pin goes in to engage it. Right, so the 3rd, 4th selector shaft has got to come out. So we tap that out from the bell housing. So with a suitable drift, in this case an old screwdriver, and then we can extract the 3rd, 4th selector shaft. Yep, and the same procedure for the 1st, 2nd selector shaft. So again, a suitable drift on the front. And there we go, that should draw out. So that's the 3 selector rods, selector shafts. Not in their first flush of youth, but I think they'll be serviceable. And then we can extract the selector forks. So now you can see the difference between the old worn out selector fork and the new replacement selector fork. This is a brand new old stock unit, so that'll work nicely. So that's good, and that is just scrap. Right, and there's the 1st, 2nd selector fork, and that's in good condition because 1st and 2nd gears are used quite briefly, so the driver very rarely sits with his hand on the gear lever for any length of time in 1st or 2nd. So 1st, 2nd rarely wears out. 3rd, 4th, that damage is usually, almost always, caused by the driver leaning on the gear stick when he's cruising along in 4th gear. Or she, doesn't have to be a he. Right, so the next bit to come out is the lay shaft. The lay shaft is the actual shaft that the lay gear runs on. So that's the straight cut lay gear that's going into the new box, into the new rebuild. But as you can see, it's a one piece with multiple gears on it. So that's 4th, that's 3rd, that's 2nd, that's 1st. And the book of worms says to tap it out with a soft drift. In actual fact, the lay shaft has just pulled out beautifully. So that's the lay shaft that the lay gear runs on. So the next thing to do is knock out the main shaft assembly. So a couple of little taps and that's out loose, and now I just need to slide the reverse gear idler out of the way so that I can get the main shaft out. Now I can remove the reverse gear idler, and then I'll stand the box up on end, and the first motion shaft can be tapped back through into the box. I've already removed the circlip off the bearing so that it will go through. Tappy tap tap, and out it comes. Now I can remove the lay gear and its thrust bearings, thrust washers. That'll come out through the main shaft hole at the back of the box. And that's the box stripped. So now the main casing components can go back to the workshop for thorough cleaning. The next part of the job is to strip the main shaft assembly, clean everything up, ready for the new bearings and gears. That's about it for this one. I'll see you in the next video.